And joining us now, our good friend Peter Navarro, Senior Economic Policy Advisor to the President and Director of the Office in Trade and Manufacturing Policy. He's also the author of one of the best-selling books ever, Death by China, which is basically the Bible of how China has been ripping us off for 50 years, basically, since Richard Nixon went there and opened it up in, I guess, 1971, 1972, something like that. It's been a long time. And Peter Navarro understands this very well. He's also been the architect of getting rid of these multilateral trade deals that we were against, like NAFTA and TPP. And he's joining us now. Peter Navarro, great to have you, man.
Great to be here with you this morning on this rainy day. It's always sunny at the White House, though.
I know, Peter, especially with you there. You're also my favorite economist ever. I've read all your books. Death by China is kind of the thing that opened my eyes. And it's as relevant now as it was when you had first written it. And you got to remember, folks, back in the day, this is now popular because we're explaining it and you're understanding it. But back in the day when Navarro was saying this and like things in NAFTA were coming out, I mean, there were like 5 Republicans in the country that were opposed to NAFTA. Me, Peter Navarro, Trump, and Pat Buchanan. That was it. And we've come a long way.
It's good company.
I know it's pretty good company, but there were only 5 of us, or 4 actually, that I can remember.
It is pretty extraordinary. I mean, there's just in 2.5 short years, President Trump has changed the entire understanding of what China is doing to this country. And there's just really strong support within government, on Capitol Hill, bipartisan support. It's one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on now. And it's good to see. But, it's taken a long time coming. There's been a lot of damage in its wake. What we have to do now is to make sure that we can defend ourselves against China's practices. It's intellectual property theft, the forced technology transfer, hacking into our computers to steal our trade secrets. A poll came out last week. I don't know if you saw this. Harvard-Harris poll showed that a strong majority of Americans support the president's tariffs on China, and 8 out of 10 Republicans just about, which makes me wonder what are the Democrats thinking? Why aren't they tough on China? It's strange.
Well, that's because of just Trump derangement syndrome. One of our listeners, Peter, in Virginia texted us earlier, and this is going to shock you. This was Sean in Newport News, who said Trump derangement syndrome has gotten so bad that adults are hissing the Presidential Citizen Award at an elementary school graduation. This just happened to my neighbor last night. I mean, it's crazy what's going on out there. But I want to get back to China because this is what's been going on, Peter Navarro, and I know you've been fighting it, and so have I, for years. It's the Wall Street propaganda machine. Whenever you talk about tariffs in China, what they say is not that it's going to hurt them because they actually have to pay workers a decent wage in the U.S. and bring our jobs back. But what they're going to say is, it's a tax, and it's going to hammer the consumer, and it's all about the consumer, and you're going to pay more, and it's going to be economic Armageddon, and your kids are going to have to drop out of college. I mean, that's what they say.
Yeah.
But yet,
no, I'm glad you raised this because this has been a very pernicious message. The fact of the matter is, since the tariffs have been put in place, we've actually raised a little over $15 billion, not an insignificant amount of money. But the reality is China bears the burden of these tariffs because what happens in China once the tariffs got put in place is in order for these Chinese producers to keep selling into our market, they have to lower their price. They are selling us fewer exports, which is all to the good for America. They're experiencing lower profits. The Chinese government itself collects fewer tax revenues. They get a higher unemployment rate in China. And we've seen on our side of the Pacific virtually no increase in the inflation rate whatsoever from the Trump tariffs on China, on steel and aluminum, on anything. But as you say, it's in the interest of the Wall Street haters on this to somehow jujitsu it in a way that, we're paying the tariffs. Wrong. China's paying the tariffs.
Well, you're right, Peter, and because they subsidize the cost of production, which is how they dump the goods in the United States. And if you understand that, all it means is exactly what you're saying. They increase the subsidies because they have to keep employing people, and they have to find 1 million jobs annually for all the new younger people coming into their workforce. So they simply subsidize it, and so that's why there's been new inflation. I have challenged my listeners, call me up or text me with one thing that you can say, wow, I've noticed a price increase in something. Is it a 24-pack of beer? Is it your aluminum siding? Is it dairy products? Is it corn? What have you seen an increase on? I can't get an answer because none exists, because they simply increase their subsidies and they don't have the cards to deal, because we have a $500 billion trade deficit with China going their way. So there's not much they can do. But the Wall Street Journal and the other propagandizers tell you it's a consumer tax and it's like a tax increase, but they do it with no evidence. But they've been doing it for 5 decades. Finally, this president has called them out on it. And the facts bear it out, right?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that tariffs have proved to be a tremendously important tool to protect both our economy and our national security. If you look at steel and aluminum industries, they're coming back from the brink of extinction right now, employing people. I was in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago in Duluth, just below the Iron Range there, and it's just booming there, and it's great to see. So the steel and aluminum tariffs, we're defending our pillar industries in the interest of national security with China. China's been hitting us with all these unfair trade practices. With this situation with Mexico, for 20 years, Congress and the Mexican government did nothing about illegal immigration. President Trump threatens tariffs, and in 2 days he gets a really strong agreement to move forward on some solutions. I mean, this is a policy that works. Back in the history of this country, tariffs were used when we were at our strongest, and the president is really using this as one of many tools to get this economy to a point where nobody imagined, except us on the campaign trail, we could be within a couple of years. I mean, the historic low unemployment rates, not just for everybody, but for individual groups. Women and vets, lowest rate since, I think, the 50s. Blacks and Hispanics, lowest rate since the 70s. Wages are rising disproportionately for blue-collar manufacturing. One of my favorite statistics, and the thing I'm most proud about for this president, is the fact that since he's been in office, the administration has created over 500,000 manufacturing jobs. That compares to Biden-Obama days, where they lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs. And who can forget when President Obama said that President Trump could never create manufacturing jobs unless he had a magic wand? Well, I guess he has a magic wand, because it's happening. And here's another one for you, John. This fascinating statistic. In the last quarter, 72% of the people coming in to get new jobs were people who were not in the workforce being counted. In other words, these were the long-term unemployed, discouraged workers who, again, the previous administration said would never come back into the workforce. So this is a president who has a strategy that works on many vectors. Tariffs is an important one, and it's working for the working man and women in this country.
John Fredericks Radio Network, trucking the truth across America, where Trump Nation comes to talk in the morning. We're with Peter Navarro, Senior Economic Policy Advisor to the President, Director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. He's also the best-selling author, Death by China. Peter, let's get back to Mexico. The fake news, lying legacy media coming out Sunday, led by the New York Times, saying that the president's claim of victory with Mexico was a facade. He said all these deals were already agreed to. He did nothing. Yet none of them, whether they were agreed to or not, nothing was getting implemented or done. How do you respond to that?
I just, when that narrative started coming out, it's like, the president walked on water. They say he couldn't swim. I mean, come on. This was a brilliant strategic gambit, and in 2 days, Mexico agreed to a set of actions which we've been trying to get them to do for years. Mm-hmm. The reality is this. The problem we face is that on any given day here in America, down in Mexico, there's about 100,000 people moving from the Guatemala-Mexico border in the south up to places like El Paso and San Diego and beyond. Mm-hmm. The narco-traffickers, the human traffickers, run this conveyor belt and have turned illegal immigration into one of Mexico's biggest exports. And we haven't been able to do anything because Congress won't pass legislation to close a bunch of loopholes that allow this humanitarian crisis and national emergency to continue. So what the president did was invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which allows strong action when there's a threat to our national security, economy, or foreign policy. And tariffs were an appropriate regulatory response in this situation. It got Mexico's attention. The president, the vice president, Secretary of State Pompeo, Pat Cipollone, who's our White House legal counsel, Jared Kushner, and others did a wonderful job over a 48-hour period negotiating with the Mexican side. And to the Mexicans' credit, they came to the bargaining table in good faith. And now we've got a plan that's being implemented on the southern border, on our southern border, on Mexico's southern border, and on that conveyor belt in between. So let's see what happens. I mean, we're hoping that this action will lead to a dramatic reduction in this trafficking of people, which is it's just a terrible situation.
Now, Peter Navarro, one of the things that the president was asked yesterday, I was at the bilateral press conference with President Poland duty yesterday at the White House. One of the things that he was asked by, I think it was Jeff or one of the U.S. questioners, was, what is your time frame here with Mexico? When do we know if it's successful or not? And he answered the question by saying, it's in my head. I'm going to make that decision. I've laid no benchmarks out. What is the genesis of that strategy?
Well, look, here's what we know. It's about a 21-day journey from the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala up to our border. So we should know in about a month or two what the situation is. The hope is that the word will spread that people coming up will no longer be able to be in the U.S. waiting for asylum. That's been one of the big spurs bringing people up from the South, this idea that they can make a fake asylum claim and then get released in the U.S. For a court hearing a year or two later and then disappear into the wind. That's kind of the Achilles heel of the whole system now. And with the Migrant Protection Protocol, what Mexico agreed to do is to take those folks and keep them on Mexican soil, which is appropriate because they shouldn't be able to come from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador or elsewhere and claim asylum in the United States when Mexico is between us. So the word should spread back south that this game is over, this con game that the human traffickers play, and the troops on the southern border should be able to secure that border. John, that's a 150-mile border with choke points. A lot easier to seal that border than it is to seal America's 2,000-mile border, which has vast expanses where Congress has refused to let us put a wall up. And so let's see what happens. But we expect good faith from the Mexicans and a strong reduction in this conveyor belt flood coming up.
No downside. I mean, what the president did, I mean, nobody can argue with the fact.
There's no downside.
There's no downside.
Right. Bingo.
There's no downside. I mean, the Mexican government was whether they had talked about these initiatives or not, they were not doing them. And so as soon as the tariffs were announced and the Mexican government and AMLO knows, he can't, again, you got a $350 billion of trade going from us to them. That's cash going to them. I mean, a 25% tariff on that is $80 billion. They can't take that out of the Mexican economy. So at the very least, they get a bunch of diplomats on an airplane the next hour and fly them to D.C. And now you guys are in negotiation, which without this initiative, they'd still be in Mexico City. So there's absolutely no downside. And, you know, the New York Times article I thought was about the biggest piece of asininity I've ever seen. Talk about fake news. You know, Peter, they're almost turning into The Onion. It was a ridiculous piece.
I was appropriately stunned on Sunday when I started reading some of this coverage. I'm thinking, here we've just had one of the most brilliant strategic gambits by a president, not just in modern history, but in history.
Right.
And before the ink's dry on the agreement, they're spinning it as if it somehow was a failure. I mean, go down to the Guatemalan border. You can see 6,000 troops. Go up to our border. You can see that we're going to be having, through this protocol, this migrant protection protocol, a substantial number of these asylum seekers be domiciled in Mexico. You're going to see activity throughout the country of Mexico on this conveyor belt, to slow or halt that conveyor belt. That's real stuff. It wasn't real what was written about it.
Unbelievable.
Crazy stuff.
It
really is. I mean,
it's crazy.
Like the president. I was so proud of him for doing this. I mean, he just does courageous, brilliant things. And you know, when he first came out with that announcement, like heads were exploding on Capitol Hill, and then 2 days later, it's like, oh, well, that worked.
Exactly. What about the New York Times and others reporting that yourself and Robert Lighthizer and other people that are heading up our trade policies were adamantly opposed to this? True or false?
Yeah, that's fake news. Look, what was nice about this, let's give credit where credit's due here. This was an idea that the president came up with, and it was executed beautifully with the help of the vice president, Pat Cipollone, the White House legal counsel, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and others as a total team effort. And the team, as we always do, we get behind the president's idea, and it was executed beautifully. And in 48 hours, boom. So, I mean, just all that stuff is just noise. It's just noise out there. What people need to do is, like, focus on what we actually get done, what this president gets done. Yesterday, I'm at the White House, and I watched an F-35 fly over the White House. It was cool. You know, it was more than a symbol, though, John, because what the president has done through his conventional arms transfer policy, he's been able to sell our weapon systems more quickly and in greater quantities to our partners and allies like Poland. And the reason why that F-35 flew over is because Poland's buying the F-35. And you know what that means? It means a stronger NATO alliance, but it also means more jobs across the 40-plus states in America that constitute the supply chain of the F-35. Economic security is national security. This president gets it done. That's what the New York Times and other papers should be writing about.
What if they wanted to be honest about it? All they wanted to do is perpetrate a false narrative against the president. I know you've got a meeting at 8. I've only got about a minute and a half. But one final thing. The farmers in Iowa, I've met with several representatives of smaller farms, not the corporate farms, smaller farmers who are petrified about what is going to happen to them and their inability to be able to sell soybeans and other farm goods to China. What is your message to them, Peter Navarro?
President Trump and Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue have your back. We have worked really hard to devise programs to help the farmers when China singles them out in retaliation. And just a week or two ago, Sonny announced a $16 billion expenditure for farmers to keep them whole. The president just this week was in Iowa celebrating the E15 standard, which will be a tremendous help to corn farmers there. So this president has the backs of farmers, and we're going to do everything we can to help farmers. And I think that what we need to just understand now is that what China has been doing cannot go on. And we need to be able to change that. And the president is going about doing that. And China's going to try to weaken us, buckle our knees. But we're going to stay strong as a nation behind this president.
Peter Navarro, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate your time and your candor. As always, you're doing a fabulous job. And Peter Navarro, also, look, I can say this now the interview's over, but you got to buy his book, Death by China. Just go buy it. I mean, you got to read this thing.
Keep fighting the good fight, John.
Peter Navarro, Assistant to the President, Director of Office and Trade, Manufacturing Policy. John Fredericks Radio Network.